The images fed to your screens, the pristine blue marble floating peacefully in a sterile vacuum, are digitally fabricated pacification tools. You are not living on a sanctuary planet, and you are not floating in a random empty void. You are standing on the quarantined wreckage of a dimensional war zone. What mainstream astrophysics dismisses as the asteroid belt is not leftover debris from a primordial planetary collision. It is the pulverized skeleton of a super-Earth called Maldek. Mars is not a naturally dead rock. It is a macroscopic crime scene. Its atmosphere deliberately stripped, and its surface irradiated by frequency weaponry. The cosmos you have been sold by modern space agencies is a sterilized diorama, mathematically designed to hide the active battlefield you are currently trapped inside. This is not theoretical space exploration. This is the suppressed tactical history of your localized grid. And it is the exact reason your biology feels fundamentally broken. When Maldek shattered and Mars fell, the frequency of this solar system was hijacked. The event ancient texts refer to as the Fall was not a mythological moral failing of early man. It was a calculated, violent genetic downgrade. The architects of this matrix forcefully unplugged your 12-strand crystalline architecture, capping your consciousness and locking you into a dual-strand biological survival loop. You walk around with the cellular memory of a cosmic slaughter, wondering why your nervous system is locked in a constant state of dread. The amnesia is artificial, and your ignorance is the only thing keeping the karmic contract intact. Today, we review the Casualty report. Mainstream science is the most successful psychological operation ever deployed against a captive species. They point their telescopes at the dead rocks floating in the void and tell you it is a mathematical miracle you are alive. They sell you the concept of the Goldilocks zone, a random, lucky orbit that allowed Earth to harbor life while everything else froze or burned. This is a lie of omission. Earth is not in a Goldilocks zone. It is in a localized quarantine matrix. Millions of years before the current timeline, this solar system was a thriving, high-density interconnected circuit. The planets were not isolated spheres separated by billions of miles of empty vacuum. They were resonant nodes in a macrocosmic torus field. Energy, information, and consciousness flowed seamlessly between the planetary bodies. Earth, Mars, and Maldek operated in absolute geometric harmony. But a high-density system generates an immense amount of kinetic energy. This is the exact fuel required by parasitic, low-density entities that lack a direct connection to the source field. The ancient Gnostics called them Archons. The Sumerian records detailed their arrival. They did not come to conquer physical dirt. They came to harvest consciousness. And their primary target was the crown jewel of the local grid, Maldek. Why do you think you stare up at the night sky and feel a profound sense of isolation? It is not philosophical dread. It is phantom limb syndrome on a planetary scale. You are feeling the missing node of the circuit. Right now, if you look between Mars and Jupiter, academic gatekeepers claim you are looking at primordial dust that never managed to form a planet due to Jupiter's gravity. Do not insult your own intelligence by accepting that narrative. You are looking at the physical evidence of a dimensional shatter event. They did not bomb Maldek with kinetic projectiles. They deployed advanced scalar frequency weaponry. They targeted the planet's core resonance, its 369 structural integrity, and amplified the dissonance until the planetary Torus field collapsed in on itself. Maldek did not just break apart. It violently decompressed across multiple dimensions. The shockwave of that shatter event sent a trauma frequency rippling through the quantum field. That frequency hit Mars next. And the survivors of both worlds, the genetic lineages carrying the memory of that slaughter, were eventually funneled here, to Earth. This is why your nervous system is fried. You are operating a biological avatar that contains the compressed, unhealed PTSD of a cosmic war. The anxiety you feel when you wake up is your dormant DNA, screaming that you are living behind enemy lines. The Matrix architects rely on your amnesia to keep you acting as a battery. But the moment you realize the asteroid belt is a graveyard, the illusion dies. The destruction of Maldek was not a cosmic accident. Mainstream physics wants you to believe in the chaotic, random collision of space rocks. They sell you the narrative of a rogue asteroid, a planetary fender bender that resulted in the debris field you now call the asteroid belt. Wipe that childish concept from your mind. Planetary bodies operating in a high-density torus field do not accidentally collide. They are held in perfect geometric suspension by the 369 mathematical architecture of the universe. To destroy a super-Earth like Maldek, you cannot use brute physical force. You must use the physics of vibration. You must weaponize resonance. Understand the true nature of cymatics. Sound and frequency dictate form. Every physical object in this matrix, from the physical vessel you inhabit to the planet you stand on, is simply a localized vibration holding a geometric pattern. The invading Archonic entities did not deploy kinetic missiles or nuclear ballistics. They deployed advanced scalar frequency weaponry. They calculated the exact base resonant frequency of Maldek's planetary core, and they broadcast its exact anti-wave. In quantum physics, when two perfectly opposing waveforms meet, they do not bounce off each other. They cancel each other out. This is destructive interference. But when you apply massive destructive interference to the core engine of a planet, the mass does not simply vanish. The internal torus field, the magnetic engine that binds the planetary crust together, collapses inward. The structural integrity of the 369 software is instantaneously corrupted. The result is a sudden, violent decompression. Maldek was shattered from the inside out. The tectonic plates, the oceans, the advanced architecture of a sovereign civilization, all of it was pulverized in a microsecond of absolute dimensional dissonance. The kinetic energy released by this shatter event was unimaginable. And that was exactly the point. The Orion Group forces are parasites. They feed on kinetic trauma. The destruction of Maldek was not just an act of territorial war. It was the largest energy harvest in the history of this localized grid. But the physical destruction of the planet was only the first phase of the operation. The true target was the consciousness tethered to that world. When a planetary torus field collapses, the souls anchored to that grid are violently ejected into the quantum field without a physical vessel. They become stranded kinetic energy, stripped of their avatars. This is the origin of the cosmic refugee crisis that forced the surviving genetic lines to evacuate to the nearest stable mode in the circuit: Mars. You must understand the scale of what we are dealing with. The trauma of a planetary shatter event does not dissipate into the vacuum of space. It is recorded in the Akashic field. It is imprinted into the fractal fragments of the surviving DNA. When modern society tells you to medicate or meditate to find your inner peace, they are giving you a band-aid for a severed artery. You are trying to calm a nervous system that implicitly remembers the sky catching fire and the ground dissolving into pure frequency. The asteroid belt is a constant, physical monument to the stakes of this cosmic game. The architects left the debris there on purpose. It is a psychological deterrent, a subconscious warning broadcast directly into your dormant DNA. Do not remember who you are, or we will do to you what we did to Maldek. But the fear only works if the amnesia holds. By observing the graveyard and understanding the frequency weapon used to fill it, you neutralize the trauma. You reclaim the kinetic energy they stole during the shatter event. You stop being the victim of a forgotten war, and you become the architect of your own extraction.
The shatter event of Maldek did not conclude the cosmic conflict.
It merely signaled the beginning of the local system's absolute collapse. When the planetary Torus field of Maldek violently decompressed, it unleashed a quantum shockwave of localized dissonance across the scalar grid. The immediate collateral target standing directly in the path of this dimensional tsunami was the closest resonant node in the sequence, Mars. Forget the desolate, rust-covered wasteland that modern space agencies project onto your screens, feeding you a pacifying narrative of natural atmospheric decay. The Mars of the ancient timeline was a lush, hyper-advanced biosphere. It operated on the exact same 369 sacred geometric architecture as Maldek and Earth, serving as the critical middle pillar in the macrocosmic circuit of our solar system. The invading Archonic forces, having successfully consumed the kinetic energy of a shattered super-Earth, immediately shifted their vector, but they did not use the same destructive interference frequency on Mars. They did not want to pulverize the planet into a second asteroid field. They needed a strategic outpost, a deadened staging ground for the final, ultimate assault on the crown jewel of the system, Earth. Therefore, the destruction of Mars was not a shatter event. It was a macroscopic sterilization protocol. They deployed a localized, high-yield scalar bombardment designed to ignite the atmosphere and completely strip the planetary magnetic Torus field. This is where the mainstream scientific narrative accidentally exposes its own lie. Astrophysicists staring at Mars today cannot explain the massive concentrations of xenon-129 isotopes found scattered across the Martian surface. Xenon-129 is not a naturally occurring byproduct of a dead rock. It is the specific, undeniable isotopic signature of a massive nuclear-level detonation. The academic gatekeepers shrug their shoulders, publish sterilized papers, and call it a natural anomaly. They expect you to believe that a planet naturally irradiated itself. The brutal, suppressed reality is that the surface of Mars was intentionally glassified. The atmospheric dome was ripped away in a matter of hours, exposing the sovereign biosphere to the raw, unfiltered radiation of deep space. The planetary engine was forcibly shut down, effectively murdering the consciousness of the planet itself. In the face of an atmospheric ignition, the surviving Martian civilization had only one tactical option to preserve their genetic lineage. They abandoned the surface entirely. They retreated deep into the subterranean cavern systems, utilizing advanced resonant drilling technologies to seal themselves inside the crust of their dying world. But the surface was permanently irradiated, and the planetary frequency was dropping rapidly into a suffocating, low-density state. The remaining sovereign genetic lines understood that staying inside the dead planet meant eventual Archonic assimilation, or the total starvation of their consciousness. They had to evacuate the grid entirely. They initiated the largest cosmic exodus in the history of this localized dimensional quadrant. Where do you think they went? They fled to the last remaining stable Torus field in the circuit. They came to Earth. The refugees of the Martian sterilization arrived on this planet carrying the catastrophic trauma of not one, but two fallen worlds. They brought with them the advanced architectural knowledge of the golden ratio, the blueprints of the pyramids, and the absolute mastery of the crystal grids. But they also brought the heavy, dense vibration of absolute survival. This is the genetic inheritance that courses through your veins right now. When you feel the instinctive, desperate urge to build walls, to hoard resources, and to prepare for an apocalypse you cannot even name, you are accessing the cellular memory of the Martian exodus. You are feeling the panic of a civilization that watched its sky catch fire and was forced to flee into the dark. But the evacuation to Earth was not a salvation. It was a calculated, mathematical trap. The Orion Group allowed the refugees to flee because they needed the sovereign genetic codes concentrated in one singular location. Earth was never meant to be a sanctuary for the survivors. It was the final cage. As the Martian refugees seeded their advanced civilization on this world, attempting to rebuild what was lost, the Archonic architects were already moving their most devastating piece of technology into position to ensure no one would ever escape the solar system again. The kinetic energy farm was almost complete. They were bringing the moon. The Martian exodus brought the last remnants of sovereign cosmic consciousness to Earth. They seeded the ancient civilizations you now regard as mythological: Lemuria, Atlantis, the pre-dynastic builders who aligned their megalithic architecture perfectly with the stars. They believed they had found a sanctuary, a stable, high-density node where they could reconstruct the crystalline DNA templates and heal the trauma of the two fallen worlds. But the Archonic architects did not lose track of their prey. The Orion Group operates with cold, mathematical precision. They did not launch a direct atmospheric bombardment on Earth as they did with Mars. They recognized that Earth was the final container. If they destroyed the biosphere, the kinetic energy of the sovereign souls would disperse back into the cosmic field, beyond their reach. To harvest the energy continuously, they needed to build an inescapable farm. They needed a lid for the petri dish. And so, they brought the moon. Look up at the night sky and completely discard the pacifying fairy tales you have been taught about natural planetary accretion. Mainstream astrophysics is forced to perform humiliating mental gymnastics to explain the existence of the moon. They tell you a Mars-sized object smashed into Earth, and the debris magically coalesced into a perfectly spherical satellite that just happens to be the exact mathematical size and distance to perfectly eclipse the Sun. The mathematical probability of that occurring naturally is absolute zero. The moon is not a natural celestial body. It is a macroscopic, artificial piece of technology. It is a hollowed-out tow ship, a localized command center that was deliberately anchored into Earth's orbit to finalize the hostile takeover of the solar system. When NASA deliberately crashed Apollo modules into the lunar surface, the entire structure rang like a massive bell for hours. Natural, solid planetary bodies do not ring. Hollow, metallic, artificial spheres do. The anchoring of the moon was the most devastating tactical maneuver in the history of human consciousness. It was not brought here to control the physical tides of the oceans. It was brought here to control the dimensional tides of your reality. The moon operates as a massive scalar broadcast station. It receives a dense, low-vibrational control frequency, often routed through the planetary ring system of Saturn, and projects it directly onto the Earth's electromagnetic grid. This is what esoteric traditions refer to as the Saturn-Moon matrix. It is a literal, quantifiable frequency fence. When this artificial satellite was locked into its tidal synchronous orbit, deliberately showing you only one side to hide the operational architecture on the dark side, it threw a heavy, localized energetic net over the entire planet. The sovereign, high-density Torus field of Earth was forcefully suppressed, compressed down into a dense, heavy physical vibration. This frequency fence is the exact mechanism of your enslavement. It is the invisible, electromagnetic prison wall that you cannot see, but your nervous system constantly feels. The broadcast from the lunar structure is mathematically engineered to disrupt the 12-strand crystalline DNA sequence. It acts as a static jammer, purposefully disconnecting the higher 10 strands and locking human biology into the dual-strand survival loop. It keeps your consciousness trapped in the lower 3 energy centers, focused entirely on fear, consumption, and primal survival. It is a hypnotic, sub-audible hum that blankets the planet, keeping the human battery asleep while its kinetic energy is siphoned off to feed the archonic parasites. You are born into a system that is actively, aggressively jamming your ability to remember who you are. But the most terrifying function of the lunar frequency fence is what happens when the physical avatar expires. Before the lockdown, physical death was simply a transition. A conscious stepping out of the biological suit to return to the source field. The moon changed the physics of death. The electromagnetic net surrounding the Earth acts as a literal soul catcher. When the kinetic energy of consciousness leaves the body, it rises up and hits the frequency fence. It is trapped. The white light that near-death experiencers report is not the loving embrace of a divine creator. It is the entry point of the recycling machinery. The soul is pulled into the lunar processing center, subjected to an intense electromagnetic memory wipe. And immediately funneled back down into a new biological avatar. This is the true nature of the reincarnation trap. Earth was turned into a closed-loop recycling plant, where the prisoners have no memory of the prison. To understand the architecture of your enslavement, you must first understand the biology of your warden. The entities that orchestrated the shatter event of Maldek, the sterilization of Mars, and the eventual lockdown of Earth are not the mythological demons of religious antiquity. They are not horned entities ruling over a fiery underworld. They are a highly advanced, predatory consciousness, operating within the lower fourth-dimensional spectrum. Esoteric traditions label them Archons, while modern tactical intelligence refers to them as the Orion Group. But regardless of the nomenclature, their foundational operating system is based on a singular, fatal flaw. They have deliberately severed their own connection to the prime source field. The universe operates on a continuous, infinite loop of generative energy. A divine Torus field that freely sustains any consciousness plugged into it. But to plug into the source, an entity must surrender absolute control. The Archonic consciousness refused. In their pursuit of absolute technological and dictatorial supremacy, they cut their own umbilical cord to the infinite. By severing their connection to Source, they became finite. A consciousness that cannot generate its own life force energy is a consciousness that is mathematically doomed to starve. They cannot create. They can only assimilate, imitate, and consume. They are the cosmic equivalent of a biological parasite or a rogue artificial intelligence. To survive, they must siphon the kinetic energy of sovereign beings who still hold the divine spark. This is the exact reason they invaded this solar system. They did not want Earth for its physical minerals, its water, or its geographic territory. Those are low-level, third-dimensional resources. The ultimate currency in this universe is kinetic, emotional, life force energy, often referred to in ancient mystery schools as Loosh. And the human avatar, containing the dormant blueprint of the 12-strand crystalline DNA, is the most efficient Loosh generator in the known dimensional quadrant. Earth was not conquered. It was repurposed. It was aggressively terraformed from a sovereign genetic library into a macroscopic, closed-loop kinetic energy farm. How do you harvest energy from a planetary population of dormant gods without them realizing they're being milked? You do it by weaponizing their own nervous systems against them. The human heart generates an electromagnetic torus field that is roughly 60 times greater in amplitude than the electrical activity of the human brain. When a human experiences genuine joy, creation, or sovereign power, that torus field expands, radiating high-frequency energy back into the source grid. The Archonic parasites cannot consume high-frequency energy. It burns them. They can only digest low-frequency, dissonant vibrations. Therefore, the entire matrix you live inside, the economic systems, the political theater, the constant artificial scarcity, the endless cycles of war, and the digital bombardment of your screens is not the result of human incompetence. It is a highly calibrated, mathematically precise agricultural system designed to keep your physical vessel in a perpetual state of baseline survival trauma. When you sit in traffic, agonizing over a fabricated debt, when your chest tightens with anxiety over a manufactured crisis on the news, or when you project anger at a stranger over a programmed political division, you are actively participating in the harvest. You are acting as an obedient battery. Your heart pumps out a dense, heavy wave of kinetic trauma, which rises into the electromagnetic grid, is captured by the lunar frequency fence, and is funneled directly into the Archonic feeding apparatus. They farm your fear the exact same way human beings farm livestock. This is the ultimate, horrifying reality of the Matrix. Every time you surrender your emotional sovereignty to the external circumstances of this world, you are feeding the very wardens that keep you trapped here. This is why the built-in excuse you have used your entire life is officially dead. Once you understand the mechanics of the harvest, your anxiety is no longer a personal, psychological failing. It is a symptom of unauthorized energetic extraction. You are not depressed. You are being drained.
And the only way to starve the parasite, the only way to break the karmic contract, is to completely refuse to generate the frequency it requires to survive.
To maintain a planetary energy farm of this magnitude, the Archonic architects could not simply rely on external frequency fences like the Lunar broadcast. An external prison can eventually be breached, and an external wall can eventually be climbed. To guarantee absolute, multi-generational compliance, the prison had to be built directly into the biology of the inmates. This brings us to the most heavily guarded, universally distorted event in human history. The institutional religions of this matrix have spent thousands of years selling you a pacifying, infantilizing fairy tale. They programmed you to believe that the fall of man was a moral failure. They taught you that an ancestor bit into a forbidden apple, angered a patriarchal deity, and doomed you to a life of suffering, labor, and original sin. Wipe that poisonous allegory from your consciousness entirely. The fall was not a failure of human morality. It was a hostile genetic downgrade. It was a violent, macroscopic surgical operation designed to strip you of your sovereignty. Before the quarantine of Earth, the human biological vessel was the most advanced piece of organic technology in this dimensional sector. You were not a primitive, fumbling ape, slowly evolving through random, chaotic mutations. You were a fully actualized, sovereign avatar operating on a 12-strand crystalline DNA matrix. These 12 strands were not just physical double helixes floating in a petri dish. They were multidimensional fiber optic cables. They acted as a flawless, uninterrupted antenna, plugging your localized consciousness directly into the macrocosmic torus field of the universe. With 12 strands active, humanity possessed innate telepathy, biological immortality, the ability to consciously direct the collapse of quantum waves into physical reality, and an unbreakable, direct tether to the source field. You were a literal god walking in a biological suit. But the Orion Group could not harvest a species operating at that frequency. A god cannot be used as a battery. Therefore, the biological vessel had to be forcibly crippled. Using the localized scalar grid and the newly anchored lunar broadcast, the architects initiated a devastating planetary frequency drop. This sudden, violent shift in the Earth's electromagnetic resonance acted as a localized EMP against the human genome. The Archonic forces systematically unplugged the upper 10 strands of your crystalline DNA. They did not physically extract them from your cells. They electromagnetically deactivated them. They severed the ethereal connections, leaving the hardware intact, but completely cutting the power supply. Your multidimensional antenna was brutally snapped in half. You were violently shoved out of your sovereign, quantum awareness and compressed down into a dense, terrifyingly limited spectrum of visible light and linear time. Look at what modern, mainstream genetics tells you today. They map the human genome, identify the two active biological strands that dictate your physical traits, and then they stare blankly at the remaining 98% of your DNA. Do you know what the academic gatekeepers call this vast, uncharted territory of your own genetic code? They call it junk DNA. They expect you to believe that the most sophisticated biological machine in the universe carries around 98% useless, evolutionary garbage. It is not junk. It is the unplugged, dormant hardware of your divinity. It is the severed circuitry of your 12-strand matrix, sitting idle in the dark, waiting for the correct frequency to reactivate. By capping your DNA to a mere 2 active strands, the architects successfully locked your consciousness into the lowest 3 energy centers of your biological vessel. The 2-strand human is biologically programmed for only 3 things: survival, reproduction, and consumption. You were disconnected from the cosmos and trapped in the animalistic fight or flight response. This is the exact frequency required by the harvest. Because you no longer have the internal 12-strand connection to source energy, you feel a constant, agonizing internal void. You feel empty. And so, you spend your entire life desperately trying to fill that void with the external illusions of the Matrix, with money, with status, with toxic relationships, with endless digital dopamine. You run on a hamster wheel designed to generate kinetic trauma, completely unaware that the engine you are powering is your own prison. The concept of original sin is the most brilliant psychological weapon ever deployed by the Matrix. By convincing you that you are inherently flawed, dirty, and deserving of punishment from the moment of your birth, they tricked you into consenting to your own enslavement. The karmic contract requires your subconscious agreement. When you accept the identity of a fallen sinner, you willingly surrender your sovereign right to the energy you generate. The fall of man was the day the gods were lobotomized and turned into livestock. The physical death of your biological avatar is not the escape hatch you think it is. The Matrix architects did not build a macroscopic planetary energy farm just to let their most productive batteries slip away after 80 years of localized extraction. They engineered a closed-loop system. To guarantee a permanent, multi-generational power supply, they had to hijack the very mechanics of the afterlife. This brings us to the Amnesia protocol and the ultimate deception of the Matrix. the Incarnation loop. Before the Earth was locked down by the lunar frequency fence, the shedding of the physical vessel was a conscious, sovereign transition. You simply stepped out of the biological suit and reintegrated with the macrocosmic Torus field, retaining all your memories, your accumulated wisdom, and your absolute connection to Source. But the quarantine changed the physics of death. The electromagnetic net blanketing this planet acts as a literal soul catcher. When your kinetic energy leaves the expiring body, it naturally rises, seeking the source field. But instead of expanding into the infinite, it hits the grid. It hits the artificial ceiling. You have been conditioned by modern religion and New Age spiritualism to look for the white light when you die. You are told that this light is the loving embrace of the divine, the gateway to heaven, or the welcoming arms of your ancestors. Wipe this suicidal programming from your mind. The white light is not salvation. It is the entry point of the archonic recycling machinery. It is a tractor beam. The Orion Group entities are masters of holographic projection and psychological manipulation. When your consciousness approaches the frequency fence, they do not appear as parasitic wardens. They project the holographic avatars of your deceased loved ones, or the specific religious deities you were programmed to worship during your lifetime. They use your own affection and religious conditioning as bait to willingly pull you into the processing center. Once inside the lunar processing architecture, the Amnesia protocol is initiated. If a prisoner remembers who they are, remembers the trauma of Maldek, and remembers that they are a sovereign creator, they will shatter the karmic contract and refuse to generate kinetic trauma. Therefore, your memory must be violently erased. Your consciousness is subjected to an intense, localized electromagnetic pulse, a multidimensional wipe designed to scrub the hard drive of your soul. They strip away your memory of the previous incarnation, your historical knowledge of the cosmic war, and your innate understanding of your own divinity. You are wiped completely blank. But a blank slate is not enough. They must ensure you voluntarily return to the farm. This is where the ancient concept of karma was weaponized against you. True karma is simply the physical law of cause and effect within a torus field. But the Archons distorted it into a cosmic debt collection system. They present you with a holographic life review, highlighting every mistake, every moment of suffering, and every perceived sin you committed. They use your own guilt against you. They tell you that your soul is impure, that you failed your spiritual mission, and that you must return to the physical school of Earth to learn your lessons and balance your karmic ledger. This is the ultimate lie. Earth is not a school. You are not here to learn lessons from a parasitic warden. You are here because you are trapped in an unauthorized extraction facility.
The concept of karmic debt is a fabricated contract designed to trick you into giving your consent. The moment you agree that you are flawed and must return to do better, you sign the contract. You are instantly funneled down the gravity well, shoved into a new biological avatar, and born into a dense, traumatized state, crying and completely devoid of your sovereign memory. The battery has been replaced. The loop starts over. This cycle has repeated for thousands of years. You have lived hundreds of lives on this quarantined planet, running on the same hamster wheel, feeding the same grid, and falling for the same white light trap. But the cycle relies entirely on your ignorance. The system only works if you agree to the guilt. By understanding the mechanics of the Amnesia protocol, you void the contract before you even leave the body. You refuse the light. You refuse the life review. You remember who you are, and you turn the simulation off. The most insidious aspect of the Incarnation loop is what happens the moment you open your eyes in this current timeline. You are born into a heavy, dense, biological avatar, stripped of your sovereign memory. But your cellular architecture does not forget. The memory wipe cleans the conscious hard drive, but the trauma is baked into the motherboard. This brings us to the modern condition. Look at the state of the human collective today. Look at the epidemic of depression, the paralyzing anxiety, the chronic fatigue, and the inescapable, haunting feeling that you simply do not belong here. Modern psychology and the pharmaceutical matrix have weaponized this condition. They slap a clinical label on you. They tell you that you have a chemical imbalance, a genetic defect, or a localized neurodivergence. They prescribe you synthetic compounds designed to numb your nervous system and keep you functioning as a productive gear in the machine. They want you to believe that your profound discomfort with this reality is a personal failing. Wipe that medical gaslighting from your reality right now. You do not have a chemical imbalance. You have genetic PTSD. You are suffering from the suppressed cellular memory of a macroscopic cosmic war. The anxiety that tightens your chest when you wake up is not about your mortgage, your job, or the fabricated economy. That is merely the localized trigger. The root of that anxiety is your dormant DNA screaming because it implicitly remembers the sky catching fire over Mars and the Torus field collapsing on Maldek. You are a prisoner of war, trapped behind enemy lines, wearing an avatar that was genetically downgraded to keep you weak. Understand the profound cruelty of the two-strand biological cap. By severing the upper 10 strands of your crystalline architecture, The Archonic architects created a permanent state of phantom limb syndrome within your soul. You walk through your daily life feeling a massive, agonizing void. You inherently know, deep within your core frequency, that you are a sovereign creator capable of manipulating quantum reality. You know you are meant for absolute power. Yet, you are trapped in a low-density survival loop, forced to trade the kinetic energy of your finite lifespan for fiat currency just to maintain basic biological functions. This severe dissonance between what your soul knows it is and what your physical avatar restricts it to be generates massive amounts of kinetic friction. That friction is the exact frequency the Matrix harvests. Every time you feel overwhelmed by the pointless, grinding repetition of the corporate matrix, every time you stare at the digital pacifiers on your screen feeling completely hollow, you are generating Loosh. The system is mathematically engineered to trigger your cellular PTSD. The constant barrage of fear-based news, the artificial scarcity of resources, the toxic, chemically altered food supply. None of this is accidental. It is a highly calibrated stress test designed to simulate the survival terror of a fallen world, keeping your nervous system perpetually locked in the fight-or-flight response. The architects want you medicated, distracted, and desperately searching for an external cure for an internal, dimensional wound. They want you to believe that the misery of your daily existence is just life. But the moment you diagnose the true nature of the disease, the symptoms lose their power over you. Your anxiety is not a weakness. It is the alarm bell of a dormant god trying to wake up. Your depression is not a failure. It is the profound grief of a sovereign consciousness recognizing its own enslavement. Stop treating your cosmic homesickness like a clinical disorder. To break the frequency fence, you must first stop consenting to the diagnosis of the Matrix. You must realize that your inability to adapt to a deeply sick, parasitic society is not a flaw. It is the ultimate proof of your original, untainted genetic lineage. The discomfort is the compass. The anger you feel at the system is the residual kinetic energy of your sovereignty trying to reassert itself. You are not a broken machine waiting to be fixed. You are an architect waking up in a prison you are about to dismantle. You now possess the complete macroscopic architecture of your own enslavement. You understand the shatter event of Maldek, the sterilization of Mars, the lunar frequency fence, and the violent genetic downgrade of your biological avatar. But possessing the blueprint of a prison is completely useless if you continue to voluntarily sit inside the cell. The ultimate phase of this transmission is not historical education. It is tactical application. This is the kinetic override. This is exactly how you stop acting as a battery and permanently void the karmic contract. The most critical vulnerability of the Archonic Matrix is that it absolutely requires your active, daily consent. The Orion Group entities cannot force your Torus field to generate kinetic trauma. They can only present you with holographic triggers and wait for you to react. They rely on your programmed, two-strand biological reflexes. The moment you understand this, the power dynamic of the entire solar system flips. The Matrix is not an omnipotent god ruling over you. It is a desperate, starving parasite begging for your attention. To execute the kinetic override, you must completely cease all hostile engagement with the illusion. If you fight the Matrix with anger, you generate heavy kinetic friction, and they harvest it. If you cower from the Matrix in paralyzing fear, you generate dense vibrational trauma, and they harvest it. The only mathematical way to win a rigged, parasitic game is to absolutely refuse to play. You must achieve a state of cold, untouchable non-compliance. When the localized Matrix attempts to trigger your survival response, when the fabricated economy threatens your livelihood, when the political theater demands your outrage, or when the digital screens scream at you to be terrified of an invisible enemy, you must immediately recognize it for what it is. It is not reality. It is an unauthorized extraction attempt. It is a milking machine trying to attach itself to your nervous system. You must look directly at the trigger, consciously sever the emotional reaction, and hit the kill switch on your own anxiety. You deny them the harvest. This is not passive meditation. This is active, weaponized sovereignty. Your physical heart is the most powerful electromagnetic generator in your biological vessel. It is the engine of your personal Torus field. When you consciously shift your internal frequency from the panic of survival to the absolute, unshakable certainty of a creator, your Torus field rapidly expands. You begin vibrating at a dimensional frequency that the lunar broadcast simply cannot penetrate. You become energetically invisible to the Archonic feeding apparatus. You literally starve the demons attached to your timeline. As you maintain this kinetic override, the environment inside your biological avatar begins to change. Without the constant suppression of your own fear, the dormant hardware within your cells begins to boot up. The severed, ethereal connections of your upper 10 DNA strands begin to cautiously reach out in the dark, seeking the resonance of the macrocosmic circuit. You stop operating on the dual-strand animalistic software of consume and survive, and you slowly begin to reconnect your localized consciousness directly back to the source field. You tear up the karmic contract by declaring, with absolute universal authority, that you owe no debt to this compromised system. You reject the concept of original sin. You reject the life review. You reject the white light. You declare that your kinetic energy belongs solely to you. You do not need an external savior to descend from the sky, and you do not need to wait for a magical cosmic event to rescue you from the quarantine. You are a sovereign, 12-strand fractal of the divine, waking up inside a shattered timeline. The amnesia is broken. The illusion is dead. It is time to turn the matrix off.
You now hold the macro blueprint of the ancient fall. You understand how the quarantine was built, how your DNA was capped, and how the lunar frequency fence keeps you trapped in the Incarnation loop. But do not think for a second that the architects of this matrix stopped their operations in antiquity. The cosmic conflict did not end. It simply went covert. While you are distracted by fabricated political theater and the engineered economic collapse on the surface, a shadow war is being waged above your head and beneath your feet. In the next transmission, we are tearing the veil off the modern physical operational arm of the Orion Group. We are decoding the secret shadow. We will expose the black budget infrastructure of the Dark Fleet, the reality of military abductions, and the 20-back temporal extraction programs. The digital algorithm governing your screens is mathematically designed to bury this information. It will actively attempt to sever your connection to this frequency and feed you back into the sleep state. This is D-Tune's reality. We are broadcasting the override codes. The Matrix is watching. It is time you watch them back.